All right, welcome everyone to the Institute of Historical Research Food History Seminar. I am very excited today about our two presenters, both on Egyptian food history, and they're trying to bridge the gap in some time periods. So we'll see how they do that. I am Brandy Simpson. I am a social historian of West Africa, specifically Ghana. And I work from the 17th century to the present day in Ghana. And I teach at Wesleyan College in Macon, Georgia. And we have our founder and co-convener, Kelly Spring. She is an author, an entrepreneur, a researcher, a lecturer of food history. And she just came back from presenting her work at the Museum of Food and Drink in Brooklyn on her book that just came out, Spam, A Global History. I encourage you to check out this book. It is a fascinating read. It really is. I enjoyed it so much. But let's go ahead and introduce our two presenters today. We have Hala Barakat and her paper on food in ancient Egypt. We were what we ate. And so this is beginning in the prehistoric era. The purpose of this paper is to understand and discern the culinary heritage of ancient Egypt through tangible finds using archaeo-botanist as a resource and illustrations and engravings and a few recipes. So I'm really excited to hear about what Hala has put together. And then we have Mennat Ala Dori and her paper entitled Staples and Shifts, Understanding Egyptian Coptic Foodways from the 1st century AD to the 7th century AD. So starting with the introduction of Christianity into Egypt in the 1st century and the conquering of Egypt by Muslims in the 7th century. So each of them will speak for up to 20 minutes, and then we will have some time for questions and answers afterwards. So without further ado, Hala, please share your presentation with us and tell us about We Were What We Ate.
Yes. Can you see it? Yes, good. So, this is actually part of a bigger presentation. I'm so happy to be here today and present it, where I try to cover the how the food um, heritage of Egypt has evolved over almost 9,000 years. And today because of time constraint, I'm going to focus on the from 9,000 to 5,000 before present. So it's really, that's why it's we were what we ate rather than we are what we eat. But still the idea of comparing what we ate at the time to what we're eating today still holds. So Rose, may I just go back and start again? Sorry. Sorry. Okay, so the story starts in the desert, and this is the Western Desert in Egypt. It's one of the most arid places on Earth today, where there's no plant or animal life. You can, for almost thousands of 1,000 kilometers exactly, it's just the the lands of Egypt. But when we travel along this routes in the desert, in the sand, in the Great Sand Sea and around it, we notice that there is actually a lot of traces that tells us about the occupation of this desert during prehistoric times. We see it in the form of lithic tools and artifacts, but also in the collection of stones that make what we call Steinplätze or fireplaces, where people were for sure making fire. And so it tells us that there were occupation of this desert thousands of years ago. The use of carbon-14 dating has helped us to know when exactly this was the case. And there are many sites, but the most important sites that I'm going to talk about today are the Nabta Playa, which is in the south, 150 kilometers to the west of Abu Simbel. If you've been to Egypt, then you know more or less where I'm talking about. Right in the middle of the desert, in the middle of this barren desert, we found a site or a series of sites that extends over 2,000 years of occupation. But there are two other important sites, which is Abu Ballas, right in the middle of the Western Desert, and also Ain Dalla in Farafra. It's an oasis. These three sites were excavated extensively. And through the material that was found in these sites, we could reconstruct what people living in these sites were eating. So what else do we find in these sites? Sometimes we find also ritualistic collection of rocks. This is Nabta. And lots of potsherds and huge quantities, amounts of lithic tools in the sense of arrowheads and knives and axes. Because at that time, there was no metal. So they were using the stones around them to make these lithic artifacts, making them perfectly, perfect forms and also very functional. When sites are excavated, and this is how it looks like, there are no structures. There are only surface collection of the artifacts that we've just seen, but also the settlement itself. So the sediments are excavated. And within these settlements, we can see areas where it's blackened. So it's what we call the kitchen, which are the places where they made the fire. And these sediments are dry sieved screens, on several screens sometimes, to be able to separate the fine sand from the plant material. What are the plant material? There are the charcoal and the charred seeds and grains. So everything that we find, which is very small, ranging between 3 millimeters and 5 to 6 millimeters, is screened and then sorted by hand. And this creates our archaeobotanical collection. And just to note that everything is charred, which means that we are actually working with material that is there by accident. It fell into the fire. The charcoal is the wood that was used for the fire, but the grains and seeds and fruits are the material that fell by accident into the fire and got charred. And this is why they are preserved. Otherwise, they would have perished. And this is the same material that's also carbon-14 dated and identified by archaeo-botanists. So what did we find from Nabta, for example, a site where I did my PhD, and so I know it quite well? We found many grains of wild grasses, which I interpreted as these could have been ground and cooked into what? Into a porridge, because we have the pot, so we could have cooked them. And the grasses are grasses that still grow in Egypt, but they're all wild, like the sorghum, the wild sorghum, and Echinoclua, if you know it. Panicum turgidum is one of the grains that are still used nowadays, and Digitaria, Setaria, Brachiaria, and Euroclua, tiny grains. And then we have the seeds that were probably used in a similar way. We have seeds of Berhavia and Scirpus, two wild plants that grow in Egypt, and some fruits, which could have been eaten fresh or cooked even, like Caparis. Caparis is the desert caper, still collected by Bedouins and eaten, and Gruvia, and Ziziphus pinnacrisi, the Christ thorn, seeds, Solanum nigrum, a nightshade, the black nightshade, and Salvadora persica is the toothbrush tree, whose fruits could be cooked and made, and recently has been also tried to made into a jam. But at the time, since maybe they were cooked and eaten fresh. And then tubers of plants. Tubers of plants means that we had plants that were growing in the water, and which means that we had water bodies, possibly temporary water bodies. I'll come to the interpretation of the climate a little bit later. So the tubers of Cyprus rotundus, a close relative of Cyprus papyrus, the one that's used to make the paper in ancient Egypt, Typha, a reed, Nymphia, the water lily, and Scirpus. Again, Scirpus, we have the seeds, but we also have the tubers. And then these same plants had leaves, so the leaves could have been found, although very difficult to find the remains of leaves in archaeological material. But since the plants were found, we can only think that their leaves were also eaten, like Astragalus, pulse, and they are rare. The pulses, Burhavia, which we have seen as seeds, but also Rumix leaves, Solanum leaves, Salvadora persica leaves. This is our seed and grain collection. But I also tried to go a little bit further and compare the different prehistoric sites to make sure that what we found in Nabta was not a one-time thing, but a pattern. And we found that these kind of grains that are wild and collected and eaten are also found in the two other important sites of the same period, almost 7,000 years ago. Nabta is a bit older and extending over 2,000 years. So the sorghum, the panicum, the echinoclua, these were all found in these three sites. So it shows us that it's a pattern of collecting the wild grasses and eating them. And it's a kind of one of the first foodways, let's say, of that are very, very ancient. And then the interpretation of the charcoal, which is identified, give us an idea about the vegetation that's growing around it, including the trees and the shrubs. And the interpretation of this charcoal, I interpreted it as that at that time, these areas that are completely barren, you saw the first picture of the desert, was a dry savanna. A dry savanna has a perennial framework where we have the trees, mainly of acacias, but also ziziphus, and then shrubs like Salvadora. And after the rain, the seasonal rain, we have a growth of annual plants, such as this picture is for Panicum turgidum, one of the plants so these are my pictures, so taken in the desert after a rain, which is very rare, but happens sometimes. So this dry savanna was the reason why people were living in the desert. And large settlement areas over thousands of years. These settlement areas, sometimes we have these structures that are almost like houses, but without the walls. They could have had walls, but we don't have them anymore. And within these, we have the kitchen, which is the blackened area, where we get our sediments from. So we start to make sense of the way the occupants of these sites were living, the way they were living and what they were eating. And I compared that to the collection of these grains, like sorghum, this is like sorghum grains, still happening in the Sahara, in the Sahara of North Africa, which is to the west of our sites, and where the Tuareg living in the Sahara, are still collecting the wild grains of sorghum and turgidum and echinoclua and grinding them on the slabs and making flour, some kind of a coarse flour, or even couscous out of it. And how were they harvesting it? Using their lithic tools, their knives, which are very, very sharp when they are fresh. And some ethnographic archaeological experimentation has been carried out, especially in Libya by people working in Libya on similar sites, to show that this is quite possible even today. And what could we do with the flour, with the ground grains, if we don't have an oven? We don't have ovens. So I tried to find also an ethnographic parallel. Um, these pictures come from Sinai, from these mountains in Sinai, where the Bedouins are still, keep the traditions of semi-nomad Bedouins who travel and don't have ovens. And so when they want to cook, to bake breads, they make this dough out of the flour and water, very simple, and they make a fire. And then when the fire is extinguished, they have their hot ashes. The dough is placed into the ashes to cook, turned one time, cleaned out, and eaten. I've tried it, and it's a very simple way to make it, but it's also a way to make bread when you are traveling and you don't have an oven. So it's another parallel. It's called libba, and so this libba would be more or less, of course, that's an interpretation. So archaeology is all about, I'm sure, but that it must have been like this, more or less. So it's one of the things that could have happened. And then the animals. What about the animals? What do we know? We find, of course, bones, but not a lot of bones. We find illustrations. These drawings and also engravings come from sites in the Western Desert. One of the important sites or the famous sites is the Swimmer's Cave in Gilf Kibir, where we have drawings of cows, mainly cattle. Some of them are tethered in the sense that they are more or less domesticated, held to a stone. These are the African cattle, the big horns, but also other animals. Here's another cow that's being more or less, let's say, herded. And also the wild, like the giraffes and the ostriches, gazelles and ibex and oryx. So the ostriches were particularly important. We have a lot of remnants of the ostrich eggshells. So it would be like these animals were for sure consumed, except that. So other than the plants, so we have the grains, the tubers, the seeds, cooked, eaten, ground, made into flour, maybe couscous, the fruits, and then the animals, the cows, which were tethered, were probably not consumed as cows. Cows had already this significance, this ritualistic significance. And in Nabta, we found burials of cows. So what were they using? They were, for them, the cow was a sacred animal, already a goddess. So they were using the milk for sure, and most probably also the blood. But eating, slaughtering the wild animals, such as the gazelles and ibex, and maybe foxes, which could be cooked in the pots or on direct fire. And then the ostrich. The ostrich is very difficult to hunt and eat, but the eggs are easily found and eaten, possibly raw. And then the eggshell, ostrich eggshell, which doesn't exist in Egypt anymore as wild animal nowadays. The ostrich eggshell was very useful because once emptied, it was used to carry water as a pot. And when broken, they would use the ostrich eggshell to make beads, which were used as body ornamentation. And we found lots of these in on the sites. So the ostrich was rather important. And then 7,000 years ago, climate change happened, natural at that time. And the desert became very dry, and the rain, which we estimated 250 millimeters per year, decreased. So the occupants of these sites had to move. Some of them moved south, and some of them moved east. The Western Desert occupants moved east to arrive to the Nile Valley. And by that time, the Nile floods became calmer, because until then, the Nile was wild. We call it the wild Nile. And the floods were very strong and did not allow any occupation of the Nile shores, the valley. But 7,000 years ago, the climate changed. And so the occupants arrived at the valley and could occupy it. And from that time period, we have many sites along the Nile and also one of them very important in Fayoum, to the north of the a lake, was a freshwater lake and one of the Nile branches. But the important sites like Merimda in the delta, but also Heracleopolis, Al-Omari, we're going to talk about them now. This is the sites where many of the plant remains were found and which tell us a completely different story. So looking at the plant remains from these sites, we find that we have a collection of grains and tubers and seeds, but the grains are different. Brandy, you're gonna tell me how much time, more time I have? 3 more minutes. Okay, I'll just be brief. So the idea here is that we find the barley and the wheat, different types of wheat in the different sites, and it's repetitive. So we know, and in large quantities. So we know that these were plants that were cultivated. They were, of course, domesticated grains. But even another important plant is the lentil and the peas. And other plants like purslane and fenugreek and faba, bishop, and different types of dishes, the beans. These plants were domesticated, but when we think about it, the wild progenitors of these plants don't exist in Egypt. So at one point, there was an exchange that happened. These grains and seeds came to Egypt through movement of people and movement of plants in their seeds in their pockets, were pockets if they had pockets. And they were then cultivated in the Nile Valley, depending on the Nile flood. So it's a know-how of cultivation in the Nile Valley, but of plants that did not exist. But these plants became, of course, our food heritage, because these are the plants that have been cultivated for the last 7,000 years in Egypt. And it's the beginning of agriculture in Egypt. So the pre-dynastic in Egypt is the beginning of the agriculture and a completely different way of, a different combination of plants and also animals, because by that time also the sheep and goat arrived in Egypt from the same. So where did they come from? They came, so these are like the grains that we find from Adaima, for example, work of Claire Newton, and also the structures that were different, were more like pits where they were making their bread. This is the tiger nut, an important plant that continues to be important in ancient Egypt and which is now presented as one of these paleo power foods. And of course, it has a very special history also in dynastic Egypt. We might not have time to talk about it today, but I'm open to the questions, of course. And we even have fruits like the melon, the figs, the sycamore fig. The grapes started showing up, so introduced very early, and the thorn, the Christ thorn that we had during the prehistoric site, Ziziphus pinna Christi. We ate the fruits. We still eat the fruits today. This is the Ficus sycamorus. It grows on a tree rather than a shrub like the Ficus carica, and these are the fruits of the Ziziphus pinna Christi. So at that time, we also know from the animal remains that they had the pastoralism, so they were eating the domesticated cattle to some extent, at least using the milk, but sheep and goats and pigs, which were wild in Egypt, so they were domesticated. The cattle was already an important and sacred animal, so they were eating less of it and using it for ceremonial slaughter. For example, in Heracleopolis, one of the most important sites, which is the first dynasty site in Egypt. And then hunting of wild animals, of course, continued. The gazelles and hartebeests, but also the other migratory birds and wild animals like ibex and oryx. So I will end here, and we'll of course open to questions. So thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hala. Okay.